He's already gone, Mr. Whitfield. Your daughter signed the transfer papers 3 days ago. The facility has been notified. I sat in that hospital bed, IV still in my arm, and watched the attorney's face as he said those words. He thought I didn't understand. He thought I was confused. The way people always assume a 71-year-old man who just had a mild cardiac episode must be confused. I understood perfectly. Every single word. I just didn't let him see that. I see, I said, and looked out the window at the parking lot below. He left quickly after that. My daughter's husband always sent the attorney when he didn't want to look me in the eye. Let me back up. Because this story doesn't start in that hospital room. It starts 34 years earlier, in a courtroom in Memphis, Tennessee, where I put on a judge's robe for the very first time and made a silent promise to myself that I would spend my career making sure the law meant something, that it wasn't just words printed on paper that wealthy people could rearrange to suit themselves. My name is Clifford. I'm 73 years old now, though I was 71 when all of this happened. I spent 34 years on the federal bench in the Western District of Tennessee. I've seen fraud. I've seen manipulation. I've seen people do things to each other that would curdle your blood. I thought I'd seen everything. I hadn't seen my own family yet. My wife, Patricia, died 11 years ago. Breast cancer, fast and merciless. She was 62. We had one child together, a daughter named Sandra, who was 34 when her mother passed. Sandra took it hard. We both did. For a while, we were close in the way that grief sometimes pulls people together, sharing dinners on Sunday nights, calling each other for no particular reason, taking a trip to Gatlinburg one October just because Patricia had always wanted to go and we needed to do it for her somehow. Then Sandra met Warren. I want to be fair here, because fairness is the only tool I've ever trusted. Warren Bellamy was not, on the surface, an obvious villain. He had a pleasant face and a firm handshake and a way of filling up a room with his voice that most people found charming. He sold commercial real estate. He drove a car that cost more than my first house. He laughed at all the right moments. I didn't like him from the start, and I spent a long time wondering whether that was instinct or just a father's irrational resistance to the man his daughter chose. I gave him the benefit of the doubt for 3 years. That was probably 2.5 years too long. He and Sandra married in 2016. By 2018, I started noticing things. Small things at first. Questions about the house. Not casual interest, but the pointed kind. The kind where someone is trying to find out a number. What did I pay for it? What did I think it was worth now? Had I considered downsizing? Warren asked these questions with his chin tilted slightly up and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. And Sandra would laugh and say, "Warren, stop," but she never actually stopped him. My house in East Memphis is a 4-bedroom colonial that Patricia and I bought in 1991 for $187,000. In 2018, it was worth somewhere around $640,000. I knew this because I'd had it appraised, not because I planned to sell, but because I'd noticed Sandra starting to mention it in the same breath as words like equity and estate planning, and wouldn't it make more sense? I also noticed that my credit card statements weren't adding up. Patricia had added Sandra to one of our accounts years ago, back when Sandra was in college, for emergencies. I'd never removed her. It hadn't occurred to me to do so. After Patricia died, I didn't think about it at all. Sandra was my daughter. We were family. The idea that I needed to protect myself from her hadn't entered my mind. Between January and October of 2019, someone used that card to spend $31,400 that I didn't authorize. I found out because my accountant, a meticulous woman named Beverly, who has been doing my taxes for 20 years, flagged it during our annual review. "Judge Whitfield," she said, sliding a spreadsheet across her desk. "Were you aware of these charges?" I was not. There was a $4,200 charge from a home furnishing store in Germantown, an $1,800 weekend at a resort in Natchez, grocery runs at a store 12 miles from my house but 3 blocks from Sandra and Warren's, a recurring charge for a streaming service I'd never heard of, hundreds of small purchases that individually might look like noise but together formed a very clear picture. I paid Beverly's invoice that afternoon and drove home and sat in Patricia's reading chair for a long time. Here's what I didn't do. I didn't call Sandra. I didn't confront Warren. I didn't cancel the card. I'm a former federal judge. I spent 34 years watching people make the mistake of tipping their hand before they had enough evidence to win. I was not going to make that mistake with my own daughter and her husband. Instead, I called my former law clerk, a sharp young attorney named Elliot who now practiced estate law in Nashville. I told him what Beverly had found. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Judge, I think you need to hear what I'm about to say carefully. This isn't just theft. If this is a pattern and they're doing it while you're still mentally competent, that's one thing. But the more dangerous scenario is if they're building towards something bigger." He paused. "Have they said anything about your estate? About power of attorney?" They had not. Yet. Elliot came to Memphis the following week. We sat in my study with the door closed and spent 4 hours going over everything. He helped me do 3 things. First, I created a new will, detailed, airtight, with a clause that explicitly revoked any prior versions and required 2 independent witnesses present at all signings. Elliot kept the original in his office safe in Nashville. We told no one. Second, I froze the credit card Sandra had access to and opened a new account in my name only at a different bank. I didn't close the old one. I just stopped using it and let them think it was still active. Third, I had a security company install cameras inside my home, at the front door, in the hallway leading to my study, in the living room, and at the back entrance. The cameras were small and well placed. Warren had walked through my house more times than I could count. He wouldn't notice. I then did something I hadn't done in years. I started keeping a journal. Every conversation. Every question about the house. Every time Sandra mentioned my health or my age in a way that felt like she was building a file. I wrote down dates and times and exact words. 34 years of judicial habit don't leave you just because you hang up your robe. The winter of 2019 was when things accelerated. In November, Sandra began bringing up assisted living with a frequency that felt rehearsed. Not aggressive, she was never aggressive about it. That would have been too obvious. It was soft. "Dad, you rattling around in that big house alone, I just worry." And then Warren would add something about how his parents had transitioned beautifully to a community in Scottsdale, and didn't I deserve that kind of peace of mind? The word transition kept appearing, over and over in those conversations. As if moving to a facility was inevitable. As if staying in my own home was stubbornness rather than a choice. In December, I had a cardiac episode. Minor. My cardiologist called it a warning, put me on medication, told me to reduce stress and cut back on salt. I was in the hospital for 4 days. Sandra came every day, which I appreciated. Warren came once on the 3rd day and spent most of the visit asking about my living will. I told him Patricia and I had never gotten around to updating it. This was a lie. Elliot had updated everything. But I watched Warren's expression when I said it, and what I saw there confirmed something I'd been trying not to believe for months. He was relieved. The attorney showed up at the hospital on day 4. His name was Fowler, and he worked for a firm I didn't recognize. He introduced himself as someone who specialized in elder care transitions and estate management. A phrase so smooth and practiced that I knew he'd said it many times. He had paperwork with him. A durable power of attorney form, already partially filled out, with Warren's name in the designated agent line. He said Sandra had asked him to stop by just to make things easier, just so everything would be in order. In case things progress, he said. I looked at that form for a long time. Then I looked up at Fowler and said I was tired and he should come back when I felt better. He never came back. But I recorded the entire conversation on my phone. I was discharged the next day. My neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Agnes, who had been friends with Patricia, picked me up. I had not told Sandra what time I was leaving. When I got home, Elliot was there. We spent the afternoon going through everything I'd gathered over the past year. The credit card records, the camera footage which showed Warren twice, walking through my study alone while I was in the kitchen, the journal entries, the recording from the hospital, the attorney business card I'd held on to. Elliot looked up from his notes and said, "Judge, we're past the point of wondering whether something is happening. Something is happening." We agreed that I needed to do one more thing before we went any further. I needed to give them a chance to take it, not because I wanted them to succeed, but because an attempted crime is easier to prosecute than an anticipated one. In February of 2020, I told Sandra that I'd been thinking about what she and Warren said, about the house being too much for me, about getting things in order. I told her I'd decided to add Warren to the deed as a safety measure. I watched her face. There was a flicker of something, not gratitude, not relief, but something sharper, like a dog that's been waiting outside a door, finally hearing the latch turn. I'd also like Warren to have power of attorney, I said, in case anything happens. Of course, Dad, she said. That's so smart. We'll get it all set up. What she didn't know was that Elliot had worked with a trusted notary in Memphis to create what we privately called the decoy documents, a version of the deed transfer that looked legitimate, but contained specific language that made it unenforceable, deliberately, technically void in ways that wouldn't be apparent to someone who wasn't looking. A version of the POA that had an embedded flaw Elliot had engineered. They were designed to pass a quick glance, but failed the moment anyone with a competent eye examined them. 3 weeks later, Fowler was back, this time in my living room. This time with a notary he'd brought himself, a young man I'd never seen. I signed the decoy documents with my arthritic hand and watched Fowler slide them into his briefcase. Here is what Fowler did next, which I did not anticipate. He moved faster than I expected. Within 6 weeks, he filed paperwork attempting to transfer my home using the decoy deed, a move that triggered an automatic review at the Shelby County Register of Deeds office because the deed contained specific language that flagged it. The register's office notified me directly. I was already in Elliot's office when the call came. They filed, Elliot said, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, he looked genuinely rattled. I was not rattled. I had been waiting. We contacted the Shelby County District Attorney's office that afternoon. Elliot had a relationship with one of the senior prosecutors, a methodical woman named the only person I'll refer to as the prosecutor, because the case was still active during some of what I'm about to describe. She sat with us for 2 hours and went through every piece of documentation we had, the credit card records, the camera footage, the hospital recording, the decoy documents, and the fraudulent filing, Fowler's business card and his connection to Warren, which Elliot had spent 3 months tracing through LLC filings and Bar Association records. She was quiet for a long moment at the end. Judge Whitfield, she said, I want to be honest with you. We can prosecute the fraud, the forgery, the attempted transfer. Those are clear. The credit card charges also clear. The credit card charges also clear. She paused. The power of attorney scheme is harder. The decoy was your creation. A good defense attorney will argue entrapment. The decoy, I said, was never filed. The fraudulent deed transfer was filed using documents they believed to be legitimate. The attempt was entirely theirs. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, You've thought about this longer than we have. 34 years, I said. The arrests happened on a Thursday morning in April. Warren was taken at his office. Sandra was taken at home. Fowler was picked up at his firm. I was not there. I was sitting on my back porch drinking coffee, watching the dogwoods bloom, because Patricia had planted them in 1994 and they came back every spring without fail. I'll be honest with you about what I felt in that moment. Not triumph, not satisfaction, at least not the clean kind. Something heavier. Something that I think people who've never watched a person they loved become a stranger don't quite understand. I sat there and thought about Sandra at 7 years old, sitting on Patricia's lap while I read to them from the armchair in the corner of the living room. I thought about driving her to her first day of high school and watching her walk through those doors with her backpack on and thinking, how did we get here already? I thought about the Sunday dinners after Patricia died, when it had just been the two of us, and for a little while it felt like something good might come out of something terrible. And then I finished my coffee and went inside. The trial lasted 9 days. Warren and Fowler were the main defendants. Sandra had retained her own attorney, a separation of representation that told you everything you needed to know about how much she trusted her husband when things got difficult. Her attorney, to his credit, did not pretend the evidence didn't exist. He argued instead that Sandra had been acting under Warren's influence, that she hadn't fully understood what she was participating in, that her role was peripheral. The prosecutor had anticipated this. She called Beverly, my accountant, who walked the jury through 27 months of unauthorized charges, with the same precise calm she'd used when she showed them to me across her desk. She called the Shelby County Register of Deeds examiner, who explained exactly why the attempted transfer had flagged and what it indicated about the filer's intent. She called Agnes, my neighbor, who testified that Warren had told her 3 weeks before my cardiac episode that he expected I would be in care within the year. She played the hospital recording. The courtroom was very quiet when it ended. Fowler's attorney objected to its admissibility. The judge overruled him. Tennessee is a one-party consent state. I had every legal right to record that conversation. I had known this before I pressed record. Warren's attorney did his best. He argued that the deed filing was an administrative error, that the documents had been presented to Warren as legitimate, that he'd relied on Fowler's expertise and hadn't understood the implications. He tried to paint Warren as a well-meaning son-in-law who'd been misled by a dishonest attorney. The problem was the credit card records. Warren's fingerprints, figuratively speaking, were on too many of those charges. His name was on the resort reservation in Natchez. His vehicle appeared in 3 receipts for the home furnishing store. His personal email address had been used to set up the streaming account. The prosecutor's closing was 12 minutes long. I counted. She said, "The defense wants you to see Warren Bellamy as someone who was confused, who relied on bad advice, who meant well. What the evidence shows you is a man who spent 2 years methodically taking from an elderly widower who trusted his family, who used that man's cardiac episode as an opportunity to accelerate a scheme he had been building for months, and who, when confronted with the consequences of those actions, is asking you to believe that he simply didn't know any better." Ladies and gentlemen, Warren Bellamy knew exactly what he was doing. He just didn't expect to get caught. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Guilty on all counts for Warren: fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse, and attempted unlawful transfer of real property. 4 counts, 4 guilty verdicts. Fowler, guilty on fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. His law license would be another matter, handled separately by the board. Sandra, guilty on fraud and conspiracy, not guilty on forgery. The jury believed she hadn't signed the documents herself, which was accurate. She hadn't. Warren and Fowler had handled that. I sat in the front row when the verdicts were read. I did not cry. I did not feel the surge of emotion you might expect. I felt something closer to what I used to feel at the end of a long and difficult trial. Not happiness, but the particular exhaustion that comes after sustained concentration finally releases. Sentencing came 3 weeks later. Warren received 14 years in state prison and was ordered to pay $89,400 in restitution, the documented credit card theft plus legal fees and damages. Fowler received 9 years and was disbarred. Sandra received a suspended sentence of 4 years. She would serve probation, not prison time, based on her cooperation with the prosecution during the investigation and her limited direct role in the forgery and the deed filing. Additionally, she was ordered to pay $31,400, the full amount of the credit card charges. I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking Sandra should have gotten more. I understand that. And on some level, sitting in that courtroom, part of me agreed. But here is what I've come to understand. Warren found my daughter, and he cultivated her the way a patient gardener cultivates something he plans to harvest. That doesn't absolve her. She made choices. She signed her name to things she knew weren't right, but the architecture of this scheme was his and Fowler's, and the punishment reflected that. After the sentencing, I waited until the room had mostly cleared. Then I walked to where Sandra was still sitting with her attorney. She looked up at me. I hadn't spoken to her directly since the arrests, outside of a brief conversation with attorneys present. She looked like she hadn't slept in weeks, which was probably true. "I want to say something," I said. and I want you to just listen." She nodded. "I didn't set out to put you in front of a judge. I set out to protect myself, because I could see what was happening, and I was afraid that if I confronted you directly, the evidence would disappear and nothing could be proven, and it would just continue." I paused. I hoped, for a long time, that I was wrong. I gave you chances to stop. Every time Warren pushed the conversation toward the house or the estate, you could have redirected him. You didn't. She started to say something. I raised my hand. "I'm not done. What I want you to understand is that whatever you thought was coming to you, whatever Warren told you about what my stay was worth, and what you deserved, you would have gotten it. Eventually. All of it, or most of it, not because you earned it, but because you're my daughter and Patricia would have wanted you to have it." I looked at her for a long moment. "You couldn't wait. That's what I can't forgive. Not the greed. I understand it's the oldest human failing there is. But the impatience. You couldn't just wait." I turned and walked out of the courthouse into a bright April afternoon. The house sold 5 months later. I hadn't planned to sell it. But after everything that had happened in those rooms, the knowledge of what had been discussed in my study while I was in the kitchen making coffee, the memory of Fowler sitting on my living room couch with his briefcase full of paperwork, I couldn't live there the same way anymore. A family from Cordova bought it for $695,000. They had 3 kids under 10. I signed the papers and walked out and didn't look back. I bought a smaller place in Collierville. 2 bedrooms, a screened porch, a yard large enough for a garden that I've been meaning to start for 15 years. Cost me $410,000. The remainder of the sale after taxes and fees came to just under $260,000. I split it 3 ways. $100,000 went to Memphis Elder Law Coalition, which provides free legal help to seniors navigating estate disputes. $100,000 went to a scholarship fund at the University of Memphis Cecil C. Humphreys School of Law for students pursuing public interest law. The rest went into a trust I set up for specific charitable purposes to be distributed over the next 10 years. Warren would have been furious if he'd known. All that maneuvering, all those carefully cultivated dinners and pointed questions and paperwork, and the money went to lawyers helping people like me protect themselves from people like him. There's a tidiness to that which I find genuinely satisfying. I'm sitting on my screened porch as I write this. It's early morning, the light coming through the trees, the way it does in late spring when everything is still green and not yet beaten down by a Tennessee summer. I've been sleeping better than I have in years. I take my medication. I see my cardiologist every 4 months. I play chess online most evenings. I've always found it centering, the way a good game forces you to think past the obvious move to the one that matters 3 turns later. Patricia used to say that I was constitutionally incapable of being caught off guard. She meant it partly as a criticism. I could be too deliberate, too measured, not left room for surprise or spontaneity. But she also said it was something like admiration on her better days. She knew who she'd married. I think about her a lot on this porch. I think about what she would have said about all of it. About Warren, about Sandra, about the years I spent watching and waiting and documenting and saying nothing. I think she would have been sad. I think she would have been sad. I think she would also have said, "You did what you had to do. Protect the house. Protect yourself." I protected both. The house is someone else's now. 3 kids running through the rooms where we raised our daughter. That feels right in some way I can't fully articulate. Elliot called last month to check in. He asked if I'd considered writing about the experience. Not a memoir exactly, but something practical. A guide for seniors on how to recognize the early signs of financial exploitation by family members and what steps to take. I told him I'd been thinking about it. It would help people, he said. That's the idea, I said. Because here's the thing nobody tells you. The thing I wish someone had told me before any of this started. The most dangerous person in your life is almost never a stranger. It's someone who knows your habits, your routines, your access codes and account numbers in medical history, and which chair you always sit in when you're tired. It's someone who can walk into your house without knocking and stand in your study while you're making coffee and you never even hear them. The law can protect you, but only if you're paying attention first. I'm paying attention now. I always will be. That's the part of me that 34 years on the federal bench put there in nothing, not age, not grief, not my daughter's choices, not Warren Bellamy's smile, has managed to take out. The game's not over until someone puts the king down, and I'm still standing.